Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. This function is being organized by the Ramakrishna Math Bhakta to commemorate the 125 years of the Ramakrishna mission. And I am very grateful to them for having invited me to share a few thoughts on the topic, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement in USA today. It's a big subject and there's a lot to cover, but I shall be very brief. How the movement came to be in US, the story clearly begins back into the small village in Kamarpukur, where in the year 1836, Sri Ramakrishna was born. The story of his life is well known to devotees and students of his life, of how from a very young age he showed this extraordinary love for God, how he had these amazing spiritual experiences, how he came to Calcutta, became a priest at the temple of the Divine Mother, Bhavatarini Kali at Dakshineshwar, and how he immersed himself in this quest to know the divine. Even when he was engaged in the ritualistic worship, this question always came to his mind. Is the mother real? Or is it just an image, a murti that I am praying to, that I am worshipping? And we read in his life that intense longing for the divine, what he called Vyakulata, how it consumed him to the point that one day he was ready to lay down his life because he hadn't had the vision of Mother. With that extreme longing, that extreme love, we find that he had this first ecstatic vision in which the Mother revealed herself to him. And then one after the other, he was so hungry to taste the divine being in all the different ways that was possible. He took the practices of different sects within Hinduism, but also of Christianity, of Islam, and in every way he was able to find that oneness with the divine, that the same ultimate spiritual fulfillment could be got as a result of that intense longing following each of those different paths. Through that he found what was already enshrined in the Hindu texts, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahudha Vadanti, that the truth is one, but sages call it by different names, that the ultimate reality is one. It can be reached in many different ways. Now, this truth was well known in the texts. What Sri Ramakrishna did was to reconfirm the validity, the authenticity of that revelation in his own life and made it very real to us. We also read in his life how eventually many devotees, earnest spiritual seekers gathered around him, especially some of these young men who became the foundations of the future Ramakrishna order. And their leader was Narendranath, who later became Swami Vivekananda. The story of how Swamiji and his brother disciples then gathered together in the first monastery at the Paranagar Mutt, it's well known, it's well documented in his books. We also then read how one after the other, most of these disciples wandered forth. Some went to the bank of the Narmada, some went to the Himalayas, some traversed in different parts of India. And Swami Vivekananda was so eager to experience this life of the wandering monk that he wanted to just be by himself without being followed by any of the people around him. And so oftentimes he changed his name, didn't even have a permanent name to avoid being recognized. But all that changed when sometime in the early part, maybe sometime around 1892, when they heard about, in the papers, there was a news about an interfaith gathering. They called it the Parliament of Religions that was being organized in Chicago as a part of the Columbian Exposition. And when Swamiji was in southern India at that time, and some of these young men who saw that and were so charmed by this young, charismatic monk that they thought he should be the one representing the Hindu tradition at that big gathering in Chicago. And so they went from house to house collecting funds, collecting money to buy a ticket for him to go. And even when they succeeded in doing so, Swamiji still had a little bit of doubt. Is it the right step for me to take? This was not what he was looking for, to kind of go to some distant place and represent this or that. And so he wasn't sure. So he asked these young men to distribute all the money back to the poor. If it is truly the will of the divine, then all the arrangements will happen on their own. And he kept on praying. And then we read in his books that he had this vision on the Marina Beach. He saw Sri Ramakrishna in his vision beckoning him across the seas, across the ocean. Swamiji then wrote to Holy Mother to seek her blessings and to get her guidance. And when Mother's blessing came, Swamiji knew that it was not his will, but the divine will that was calling him forth. And it so happened then that the Raja of Khetri, who was a disciple of Swamiji, had an heir born to his throne. And so he invited Swamiji to Khetri in Rajputana for the celebration. And then after that celebration, he sent his secretary along with Swamiji to Bombay to buy him a ticket. And it was the Raja who knew him as Swami Vivekananda. So the ticket was bought in that name. Swamiji took that boat, took several, I think probably 3 or 4 weeks for it to reach Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. From there, Swamiji took the train to Chicago. And on the train, he happened to meet an elderly lady named Kate Sanborn, was very charmed by him. And so she said, if ever you come to the East Coast to Boston, then I would love to host you, that you can stay with me. And then we read how Swamiji went to Chicago. It turned out that the Parliament was still 2 months away. He didn't have enough money to spend to stay all that time in Chicago. So the people suggested that you go to Boston and so that you can save some money. And so he came to Boston, became a guest of Mrs. Sanborn, whose brother knew a professor at Harvard. And through his introduction letter, Swamiji was able to then get into the Parliament of Religions, to be accepted as a delegate. Because in India, when these young men thought of sending him first there, no one had even wondered whether there was such a thing as registration needed. They all thought Swamiji had to just show up there and he would be accepted, which eventually he was. But then without going through all formalities, it wasn't possible. And so when he actually arrived in Chicago first, he realized he wouldn't be able to participate because he had not been registered as a delegate. That's why when he came to Boston, he got that letter of introduction from Professor Wright at Harvard, With that, he went back to Chicago a few days before the parliament. He was then accepted as a delegate to represent Hinduism. The rest is history, as they say. Swamiji became a celebrity overnight because clearly it was not simply a great intellect that was addressing the people of the West. It was not simply some charming personality who was speaking. It was truly a representative of the divine. There was something very special about Swamiji. Much is made in the books about the first words that Swamiji uttered at the parliament. Unlike the other speakers, he had not prepared any speech. He had hardly ever spoken in the public before. And so it was a real challenge. He said he prayed to Mother Saraswati in his heart, and then he began. And the first words were, "Sisters and Brothers of America." Amazing as it was, it had an electric reaction in the audience. We read that the people stood up on their benches and clapped, standing ovation, which lasted several minutes. Now, in the words themselves, it wasn't anything very unusual. Because if you read the history of the parliament and some of the papers presented by other speakers, we see that many of them had expressed similar sentiments, that we are all one family, that we are all brothers and sisters. But yet, the reaction that Swamiji's words evoked was very different, was as if the people were hearing it for the first time. And it seems to me that it's not simply the words themselves that made the difference, but the immense power that emerged from those words. When Swamiji addressed the audience as sisters and brothers, it wasn't merely a good sentiment. It wasn't something, an intellectual formulation. He actually saw everyone as his own brother, as his own sister. And when words come through that deep, deep realization, that actual perception, that deep experience, then the power behind those words is unimaginable. And that is what Swamiji did. And clearly, overnight then, he became a big celebrity. He made headlines the next day. And today, maybe almost 130 years after the parliament, when we try to think about that great event, although great people had participated in that parliament, most people remember only Swami Vivekananda's name. In fact, the stretch of the road in front of the Art Institute in Chicago, where actually the parliament was held, today is named after Swamiji. And so Swamiji's presence made a big difference, which all the students of his life already know. But Swamiji hadn't gone to US to stay there permanently. There was clearly an understanding that at some point he's going to return back to India. Now, the people who were very charmed by his teaching were benefited by what he had to say. They felt that, as it so often happens, a great person comes, inspires everyone, and when the person leaves, everything kind of cools down. And so people said, is there some way by which this teaching can be put on a permanent footing, that somehow this teaching can continue even after Swamiji returned to India? And that's when this idea of an organization came. Swamiji called it the Vedanta Society. The first one was started in 1894 in New York. The second one was opened during Swamiji's second visit to the West, and that was in the year 1900 in San Francisco. And the third one, in fact, the first after Swamiji's Mahasamadhi, was the Vedanta Society in Boston. And after that, many Vedanta centers emerged, many of them in the 1920s and 30s. And today, we have many Vedanta centers in the United States. Several on the East Coast. There is clearly the one in Boston. We have 2 centers in New York. There is Providence. There is one in Washington, D.C. Further down south, we have a center in Florida, in St. Petersburg. We have now the most recent center was opened in Houston, in Texas. We also have center in the Midwest, in Chicago, clearly, where this whole thing began. The Chicago Center recently opened a city center as well called the Home of Harmony, a beautiful place, a big place where they are organizing programs to have education about the different religious traditions. Um, we have many centers on the West Coast as well, several in California. The two big centers are the Vedanta Society in Southern California, with its headquarters in Hollywood. It has branches in Santa Barbara, San Diego, Pasadena, Trabuco, and then there are centers in Northern California. There is a Vedanta Society of Northern California in San Francisco, which has several retreat places. One in Olima. There is the Shanti Ashram, where Swami Turiyanandaji stayed and taught. They have a retreat in Lake Tahoe. Other centers in Northern California include the ones in Sacramento. There is one in Berkeley. Up in the West Coast, we have centers in Portland and Seattle. The list goes on. And many of these centers have their own retreat places. They also have several sub-centers as well. And there are many other Vedanta groups, often many of them having places of their own where they meet regularly. But some of these places don't have a resident Swami yet. So a lot of work is going on. And yet, in a way, the Vedanta Society, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement in the US is not limited only to what the Vedanta societies do. There are so many people living in different cities who are inspired by Thakur, Mother, and Swamiji's message through a literature, clearly. A lot of books, both published in India as well as in the United States, are now available both online and through the bookstores in our different centers. So a lot of the spread of Ramakrishna Vivekananda message has occurred through literature. And many of our centers are close to universities, and so many of our Swamis are invited to speak, to talk with, to interact with the university communities on campuses. We also are often called to in hospital settings. There are many different ways where this interaction occurs, which is not to say that we are so famous that everyone knows what Vedanta is, which is not the case. And it's interesting, today if you go out into the street and speak with an average person and say Vivekananda, chances are they wouldn't know who we are talking about. If we say Ramakrishna, chances are they might think it's something to do with Hare Krishna or Krishna consciousness. Clearly, ISKCON in many cases has a bigger public profile. Vedanta Society, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda centers of the Ramakrishna order, have right from the beginning mostly kept a very low profile. In other words, they haven't gone out of their way to advertise and become famous. So most of the ways in which the centers have become known is through word of mouth. Nowadays, of course, many of the centers have their own websites. There are podcasts and streamings which have brought us in a greater public light. But this kind of keeping a low profile has been very helpful. because essentially it keeps out mostly just curiosity seekers, people who just come out of curiosity. So, what most of our centers have are serious spiritual seekers, people who are earnest, people who want to know, people who want to study, which is a good thing. So, success of a movement is not to be measured in terms of how big crowds we get or what numbers we get. That might be a one way of doing so, but not necessarily always a perfect way of doing it. But I think a better way would be how many of the people who come to these Ramakrishna Vivekananda centers are earnest. How many of these people are truly making spiritual progress? How many of these people are truly discovering this inner transformation? Those are ways I think are better modes to judge whether the movement is making progress or not. Oftentimes, people quote what Swami Vivekananda said, that I have given the world enough to digest for 1500 years. That's a big uh, time interval. And compared to that, we are just about little over 100 years now. So there is a long way to go. But even more interesting is what Sister Nivedita is reported to have said. In fact, I believe she wrote it in a letter, if I'm not mistaken. So she said, long after those of us who knew Swami Vivekananda are gone, this whole movement may seem to have gone underground. And then 40, 50, 60 years later, it's just like you plant a seed and the tree doesn't come immediately, but it takes time to germinate. And over time, later on, we will see Swamiji's message sprouting everywhere. And by that time, many people may not even know who had planted the seed. It's a little bit like when we go out and eat mangoes from a mango tree or apples from an apple tree. Oftentimes, we don't know who planted that tree, how many years ago, how much effort was taken to water and take care of the growing sapling and the plant. So we are able to enjoy those mangoes without having any idea about who planted the tree. That's what we see in the West today. The ideas which were so new and exotic when Swamiji came here, this deep, not just the ideas, but the power that he injected into the Western society, those things are now beginning to sprout. And it started sometime in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, say about 40 or 50 years ago. So, unusual as it might seem, that some of these ideas which were very much associated with Eastern traditions, definitely Hinduism and others, ideas such as reincarnation or rebirth, of karma, of the way of disposing the dead, whether it's burial or cremation. A lot of the ideas associated with the Hindu tradition are now becoming more mainstream. Whether or not the specific theologies of the different religious traditions accept rebirth or not, an increasing number of people in the West today believe that rebirth is a strong possibility, that something similar to karma does exist in the universe. The idea that there is something unchanging, something divine, a divine spark, it may be expressed in very different ways in different circles, but the idea of the some divine element hidden behind this human facade inside of us. That idea is becoming more and more common without people necessarily ascribing it or acknowledging the source to be Vedanta or Ramakrishna or Vivekananda. But all these ideas now, which had some amount of resistance 100 years ago, but they are becoming commonplace. And I think that's the real miracle that Swami Vivekananda had brought about. That's a great contribution that the Ramakrishna mission, through its Vedanta centers in the West, has brought about. Without claiming necessarily all the credit for the change that is occurring. And name is not what Swamiji wanted, the name is not what Thakur wanted or Mother wanted, and that's not what the children, their children, spiritual children today, they don't seek it either. So I would strongly caution against judging the success of the movement by how much famous or popular it is, but a better way to judge what this movement has achieved is looking at how Western society has changed, and in some measure at least, how much of that change can be traced back to this tremendous power that Swamiji injected into this, what they sometimes say, the collective unconscious of Western society, which we are able to see today. And so in some ways, those of us who are in the West today, both monks as well as the students and devotees of Vedanta, are inheritors of that great legacy of Swamiji. And there is much to learn from this, that if Vedanta as a system of thought, but also as a way of living, can be so meaningful, so relevant, even across the national cultural boundaries of the Indian subcontinent, where it took birth, where it flourished, but how it has now gradually spread all over the world. We need to make sure that these principles remain strong even in the land of its birth. That while we can be justifiably happy and feel good about the fact that Vedanta has traveled in distant corners of the globe and is being recognized and is being appreciated, we also have to make sure that in the land of its birth, in India, we remain rooted in that tradition. Because oddly enough, even as we see a greater appreciation of Eastern thought in Western society, we are also seeing a greater appropriation of Western ways of thinking and doing in many Eastern cultures, certainly especially in urban areas, in the metro cities in India. So while that is exactly what Swamiji wanted, if we can take the best of the East and the best of the West and put it together, the strength of the East and the strength of the West, there is a much that West can learn from the East, and there is much that East can learn from the West. And the future, the ideal human being of the future, would be one who can combine the best of each into their own lives. That would be ideal. What we have to be careful about is that if we are not alert, there is a real danger that the weakness of the East and the weakness of the West could get combined, and then that will be the real tragedy. And sometimes that which is not good sometimes looks very attractive. That which is really wonderful may in the beginning look somewhat boring. Sometimes it does to some people. So at that time that we need to then know our own history, we need to learn from the lives of these great ones to make sure that if we have to be true representatives of Vedanta, but also true representatives of Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, the Holy Mother, then their teachings must somehow live in our own hearts. Extent to which we can truly represent them will depend on how truly we have imbibed their teachings in our lives. It's not so much a matter of how much we have read, it's more a matter of how much of it we have lived. Because ultimately, spiritual progress is gauged by our life, not so much by our knowledge. And so, to summarize, the impact of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement in the West has been profound, but also very gentle, also very subtle. To those who look carefully, we can see how much the movement has affected and transformed the Western way of thinking in some critical areas. And we also see what we need to do going forward. And one of the first things that we can do is also learn some of the things from the West. Swamiji very famously said how he was impressed by the capacity to organize in the West. He said he had fallen in love with organization in the West. How Westerners are so good at taking an idea, getting together, pooling all the resources, organizing, and doing something about it. So that's the skill, the discipline that we can learn from the West and combine that with this great ability to look in our hearts and search for the truth within. The best of the West, the best of the East. And I think that going forward can be the guiding light for the Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement in US. Both the East and the West need each other. They depend on each other. They both can learn from each other. So my humble prayer at the feet of Thakur, Mother and Swamiji, that through their infinite grace, may our hearts be filled with their light, their love, their wisdom. Their grace may protect us, guide us in our own individual journeys, and also to whatever little extent we can to help the people around us as well. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhum.